A poor cowboy rode into the mountains to claim his dead uncle's cabin, but what he and his horse uncovered beneath the snow would rewrite a century of silence. The wind dragged across the Montana Valley like a ghost searching for a name. Jonas Clay rode with his head low, his horse's breath curling in the cold air. Folks in town had laughed when he left, said he was chasing a curse, not an inheritance. But as he neared the forgotten cabin, the world around him fell silent, and something beneath the snow began to whisper his uncle's name. The wind rolled down from the Montana highlands, cold enough to bite through leather and bone. Jonas Clay leaned forward in the saddle, his breath curling into small ghosts before him. The horse beneath him, Dusty, a paint with a patchy coat and old eyes, moved at a patient pace, one hoof at a time, as if he understood there was no reason to hurry. They'd been riding for 3 days since leaving Bitter Ridge, a small town full of faces that smiled only when they were sneering. The last thing Jonas had heard before he left was laughter. "Old fool," one man had called. "You're riding 50 miles for a shack and a curse." Another added, "Ain't nothing up there but ghosts and pine needles." Jonas didn't answer. He hadn't answered to much of anything in years. He'd learned that silence was its own armor. Dusty's ears flicked against the wind. Jonas rubbed his neck, feeling the warmth under the shaggy winter coat. "Just us again, boy," he muttered. His voice was rough from cold and years of whiskey that hadn't been worth the money. "Let's see what kind of mess Uncle Elias left us." The road narrowed into a trail between dark pines. Above, the sky was bruised gray, and the sun, a faint coin, hung low over the western ridge. Every few miles, a crow broke the stillness, its cry sharp as a nail in wood. Jonas had always hated that sound. It reminded him of gunfire and the echo of men dying in canyons a decade ago. He'd worked the army drives. He'd hunted mustangs for cash. He'd broken bones and promises in equal measure. Now, at 58, all he had left was the horse and a piece of land he never asked for. He reached the crest of a hill near dusk. Below him stretched a frozen valley. The river curled like a ribbon of glass. At the far end, half buried under snow and silence, stood a small cabin. Leaning, forgotten, almost part of the land itself. Jonas stopped Dusty and watched smoke drift from one chimney farther down the valley. It was the town's edge, the last sign of people for miles. He wasn't sure whether that comforted him or not. He dismounted slowly, stretching his back until it cracked. Dusty shook out his mane, snow scattering like dust. Jonas adjusted the saddlebag, where a single loaf of bread, a coffee tin, and a revolver rested beside an unopened letter, the one from the county lawyer informing him of his inheritance. The wind changed direction, carrying the faint smell of pine pitch and frost. It reminded him of his uncle's barn when he was a boy, before everything soured. Elias Clay had been a strange man even then, half preacher, half doctor of beasts. He'd gone off to serve in the war tending army horses and never came back the same. People said he'd gone mad out there, talking to the animals more than to folks. Jonas had never known if that was madness or mercy. He mounted again, letting Dusty pick the path down. The snow muffled every sound, the world reduced to breathing and hoofbeats. By the time they reached the valley floor, the light had thinned to blue. The cabin appeared out of the trees, small and leaning, its roof sagging under the weight of winter. Jonas tied Dusty to a post that looked ready to splinter and climbed the steps. The porch groaned under his boots. The door hung crooked, but gave way with a push. Inside was darkness, the air thick with dust, and something else. Loneliness, maybe. It had a smell, he realized, like old paper and cold ash. He set his saddlebag down and struck a match. The flame trembled in his gloved hand, throwing shadows across the walls. A table stood in the corner, half collapsed. A rusted stove. A bed frame with no mattress. On the wall above the fireplace, a single horseshoe hung upside down. Bad luck, folks would say. Jonas almost smiled. Maybe Elias had done it on purpose. He found a few pieces of wood stacked near the hearth and fed them into the stove. The match hissed and caught, and soon the cabin filled with the first breath of warmth it had known in years. Jonas sat beside it, holding his hands out to the fire. He listened to Dusty shifting outside, snorting softly. "Not much of a palace," he said aloud. His voice bounced off the walls. "But I guess it's home for now." From his saddlebag, he pulled a dented tin cup, poured a little coffee powder, and melted snow into it. The water hissed, bitter and thin, but it was enough. He leaned back against the wall, feeling the stiffness ease from his bones. Through the window, he could see the faint shape of Dusty under the pale moonlight. The horse lifted its head every few moments, ears twitching. Jonas trusted that instinct. Horses heard things men ignored. He thought of Elias again, how he used to whisper to the animals, like they were equals. Maybe he'd learned something Jonas never had. He sipped the coffee, staring into the flames. They danced in the stove's mouth, twisting and reaching, painting the cabin with orange ghosts. For the first time in years, Jonas felt the strange pull of memory. Soft and unwanted. His mother's voice, the smell of rain on hay, the laughter of someone he used to love. All gone now, like the world outside. He took the lawyer's letter from his pocket, unfolded it, and read it once more by the firelight. To Mr. Jonas Clay, the property known as Lot 27, Pine Hollow, formerly owned by Elias Clay, deceased, has been legally transferred to you as next of kin. The estate includes 1 cabin and adjoining pasture land. The paper crackled between his fingers. No mention of debt, no mention of value. Probably none to speak of. But still, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been drawn here for a reason that had nothing to do with land or money. He set the letter aside, pulled his blanket around his shoulders, and watched the fire burn lower. Outside, Dusty snorted again, uneasy. Jonas listened, then heard it too. A faint creak, like wood shifting, or a board lifting somewhere beneath him. He frowned, stood, and pressed his boot against the floor. The noise came again, from the far corner of the room. "Old place settlin'," he murmured, though he didn't quite believe it. The wind whistled through a crack in the window. The shadows moved across the walls like water. Jonas waited a moment longer, then shook his head, too tired to care. "We'll deal with it tomorrow," he muttered. He threw another log on the fire and lay down on the floorboards. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin. His eyes drifted shut, but before sleep took him, he thought he heard a sound from outside. A long, low whinny, not of fear, but of warning. Dusty's voice. Jonas didn't move. The wind rose again, carrying the sound away into the dark pines. He pulled the blanket tighter and whispered to himself, the words half prayer, half resignation. "Tomorrow, we see what the ghosts want." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the trail that had brought them here, erasing, as if on purpose, every step that led back to the world he'd left behind. Morning came pale and colorless, the sky stretched thin as smoke. Jonas woke stiff on the cabin floor, the fire reduced to a faint orange pulse inside the stove. His breath fogged in the air. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then the smell of cold wood and the sound of Dusty pawing outside brought it all back. He sat up slowly, rubbing the ache from his shoulders. The floor creaked beneath him, one board softer than the rest. He pressed a palm to it, feeling the faint give under his weight. Something hollow beneath. He frowned, stored the thought away, and went to check on the horse. Dusty stood in the lean-to barn behind the cabin, a ghost in the morning frost. His coat steamed faintly, breath rising in clouds. Jonas brushed the frost from his mane and checked the feed. "We'll have to ride into town soon," he said quietly. "Get some oats, nails, coffee. Maybe see what else this place is worth." The horse blinked, unbothered. Jonas gave him a long look. "You wouldn't care if we stayed, would you? You just need sky and grass." Dusty shook his head, the bridle strap clicking softly. When Jonas stepped back inside, the cabin looked smaller in daylight. The walls leaned slightly inward, the roof sagged under its own weight. Still, there was something about it. A feeling, not comfort, but presence. On the hearth, the ashes from last night had cooled to white dust. He crouched to stir them, then froze. Beneath the gray powder, carved into the brick with the tip of a knife, were words. "Forgive the living." The letters were shallow but deliberate, the kind a man leaves when he knows he won't be heard any other way. Jonas brushed his fingers across them. "Forgive the living," he murmured, tasting the weight of it. He made a slow tour of the room. Behind the stove, a shelf had collapsed, spilling books swollen with damp. He picked one up. The cover came away in his hand. Pages of medical sketches. Bones, horses' legs, crude anatomy. His uncle's handwriting filled the margins. "Pain teaches obedience. Trust is the cure." Jonas laid the book down carefully. He'd forgotten Elias had been a veterinarian. Folks used to bring him injured cattle, broken dogs, anything that breathed. Said he could calm even the wildest Mustang just by talking to it. But something had broken in him after the war. The army had taken him to tend horses on the front, and when he came back, he was quieter, haunted. Jonas had been 10 years old then, hiding behind his mother's skirts, staring at a man who no longer looked like family. A sudden thud broke the silence. Jonas turned. Dusty's hooves struck the floorboards outside the back wall, one sharp, angry sound. "Easy!" he called, stepping to the door. The horse was stamping, ears pinned. His front hoof had split a section of loose plank near the water trough. Jonas crouched, pried it up. Beneath the dirt and straw, the corner of a small wooden box appeared, edges darkened by time. "Well, I'll be damned." He brushed away the grime, lifted the box out, and carried it inside. The hinges squealed when he opened it. Inside lay a folded cloth bundle, stiff with age. When he unwrapped it, dust swirled in the air like ash from another fire. There was a photograph, sepia, the corners curling. A man and a woman stood beside a white horse. The man was Elias, younger, cleaner, wearing a soldier's coat. The woman was native, her hair in long braids, eyes steady on the camera. Jonas turned the photo over. On the back, a single line in faded ink. Naya and Spirit, 1873. The name felt foreign on his tongue. Naya, he said quietly. The sound of it filled the empty room like a whisper that didn't belong to him. Beneath the photo lay a small leather-bound journal tied with a strip of rawhide. He untied it carefully and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, slanted, familiar. Elias's. June 3rd. Found the mare again. Shot in the shoulder, same as before. She trusts me now, though she trembles when I lift my hand. The girl who owns her says the army took her father's herd. I told her I would help. God forgive me if I'm lying. Jonas read the words twice, feeling the air around him grow still. A memory stirred. His mother's stories of Elias, being stationed out west during the Sioux campaign, how he'd come home sick, skin yellowed, eyes wild. Folks whispered he'd sided with the tribes, that he'd lost his rank protecting savages. The truth, it seemed, had been buried here all along. He closed the book, heart thudding in the quiet. "What the hell did you do, Uncle?" Outside, a gust rattled the cabin. Dusty whinnied, sharp and short. Jonas tucked the journal into his coat and stepped onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted lazy through the pines, catching in the horse's mane. The valley was silent, but for the groan of trees in the wind. He felt watched, not by people, but by the land itself, as if the earth remembered everything Elias had done. He looked toward the ridge, where the timber line met the open sky. Somewhere beyond those trees, the rest of that story waited. That night, he sat again by the stove, reading by the dull orange glow. The entries grew darker. Elias wrote of soldiers burning camps, of orders that twisted right and wrong until they were the same color of ash. And between the lines, Jonas sensed another story. A man falling in love with someone he was forbidden to love. July 14th. She calls the horse Spirit, says he was born in a storm, lightning marked. I think she sees me as the same. Something wild, something that shouldn't have survived. Jonas shut the journal, his chest tight. Outside, Dusty shifted, stamping softly. The sound steadied him. Spirit, he whispered. That your kin, boy? Dusty flicked his tail, the firelight catching the faint white blaze on his forehead. Jonas leaned back, staring into the stove until his eyes blurred. The words carved on the hearth replayed in his mind. Forgive the living. He thought of all the things a man could do in a lifetime to need forgiveness. War, betrayal, cowardice. He'd known them all in one form or another. But maybe Elias had carried more than guilt. Maybe he'd carried love. And love unspoken turns sour if it's left too long in the dark. Jonas set the journal on the table. He would read more tomorrow when the light returned. For now, he lay down beside the stove, pulling the blanket to his chin. Dusty's breathing outside slowed, a steady rhythm against the moan of wind. Jonas closed his eyes, and in the thin edge of sleep, he thought he heard another sound. A woman's voice humming, soft and low, somewhere in the trees. The melody was old, almost a lullaby, but filled with a sorrow deeper than any storm. He didn't move. The sound faded, replaced by the whisper of snow on the roof. "Forgive the living," he murmured once more, the words slipping from him like breath. Then silence, and the slow, steady beat of the horse's heart just beyond the wall. The wind had quieted by morning, leaving a hush over the valley that made every sound sharp and lonely. Jonas woke to the smell of smoke from the stove, the last ember still glowing. He sat up, rubbed his hands together, and looked toward the table where the photograph and journal lay. They seemed different now, less like objects and more like company, silent, waiting. He poured a little water into the coffee tin, set it over the small flame, and watched the steam rise. Dusty shifted outside, his hooves crunching softly on frost. "Another day," Jonas muttered. The air felt heavy, as if it carried memories that weren't his. He picked up the journal again, fingers tracing the faded leather cover, then began to read where he'd stopped. August 3rd. They came to the valley again today. "Soldiers. Looking for strays," they said. "But I know better." They looked at her as though she were the stray. Elias's handwriting grew uneven. The lines slanted as if his hand had trembled. Jonas read slowly, hearing his uncle's voice through the scratches of ink. The entries told of a summer that changed everything. How Elias had treated wounded horses for the army, how he met Naya, and how she brought him a horse shot through the shoulder. Spirit. She spoke little English, but enough. When I said I could save him, she smiled, and I forgot the sound of war for a while. Jonas shut the book for a moment. He could almost see them, two people bound by a wounded animal, the one bridge between worlds. It wasn't hard to imagine how love could grow there, quiet and hidden, like wildflowers in the cracks of stone. He stood, stretched his back, and decided to look around the cabin again. The morning light came soft through the window, touching dust motes that danced above the table. In the far corner, a small chest sat beneath a coat of grime. Jonas knelt, pried it open, and found a bundle of letters tied with string. The envelopes were yellowed, edges curled. Some bore military stamps, others were plain. He carried them to the light and untied the bundle carefully. The first was addressed to Elias Clay, Bitterroot County, Montana Territory. Inside was a note written in a woman's hand. Elegant, but firm. "You told me forgiveness was for the living, Elias. Then forgive yourself. The dead have no need for mercy. N." Jonas's chest tightened. The letter wasn't dated, but the ink had bled at the edges, as if it had been dampened by tears or rain. He opened another. Different handwriting, a man's this time. "Dr. Clay, your resignation has been received. You will not be reinstated. The matter regarding the incident near the reservation remains closed. There were several more, some half-written, some never sent. One contained a pressed flower, brittle and pale. Another had a smear of red. Blood or ink, he couldn't tell. Jonas set them aside gently, the way a man handles a sleeping child. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the wood ceiling. So this was the truth the town had mocked. Elias, the mad doctor, had loved a woman he wasn't supposed to love, defied orders, and paid for it. Jonas felt anger rise, not at his uncle, but at a world that punished kindness and called it madness. Dusty snorted from outside, breaking his thoughts. Jonas stepped to the door. The horse was standing near the creek, ears pricked, staring at something in the trees. Jonas followed his gaze, but saw only snow and pine shadows. Still, the feeling returned. That sense of being watched, not with malice, but curiosity. He walked to the creek. The water was frozen at the edges, the current whispering under a thin crust of ice. A few yards downstream, something caught the light. He crouched, brushed aside frost, and uncovered a piece of metal. It was a small locket, silver, the chain long since broken. Inside was a lock of black hair and a single word engraved beneath. Naya. Jonas closed it, fingers trembling. "So you were real," he said softly. "You lived, you loved, and they buried you in silence." He slipped the locket into his coat pocket, the metal cold against his chest. Back inside, the cabin felt smaller, almost suffocating. He opened the window a crack to let in air. Outside, the sky was deep blue, clouds dragging their shadows across the snow. He could hear Dusty moving, the faint jingle of tack. For the first time since arriving, Jonas felt the pull of purpose. There was a reason he'd come here. Maybe the past wanted to be heard, not hidden. He picked up the photograph again, studied Elias's face. Younger, yes, but the eyes were the same. Steady, sad, the kind that carried secrets too heavy to share. Jonas poured another cup of coffee, took a slow sip. "All right, Uncle," he murmured. "If you left me this mess, then I'll see it through." He began sorting the letters, placing them in order by the little he could read from the fading postmarks. Between them, a loose page fell to the floor. He bent to pick it up, recognizing the same handwriting as in the journal. "If anyone finds this, the truth is buried beyond the pines. I could not save her, but I buried what was left where the light first touched her face. Forgive me." Jonas stared at the line, where the light first touched her face. He turned to the window, to the ridge beyond the trees where the morning sun always struck first. The meaning was clear. A burial. A secret left to the earth. He folded the note and placed it with the others. The air felt colder now, heavier. He fed another log into the stove, watched sparks climb the pipe like fireflies. Dusty's shadow moved past the window, calm again. Evening came early, spilling gray over the snow. Jonas lit a lamp and read more of the journal. Elias's words grew desperate near the end. They said she'd been taken. "I searched 3 days in the storm, found only the horse's bridle and blood in the snow. I told the town she was gone, but I still hear her singing when the wind moves through the pines." Jonas closed the book and sat back, the lamplight trembling. He thought about how easy it was to vanish in these mountains, how silence could swallow the truth whole. The wind picked up, outside, brushing against the window panes like a hand. Jonas looked toward the door. He imagined his uncle sitting where he sat now, alone with guilt and ghosts. Maybe Elias had written those words not as confession, but as invitation, so someone else would finish the story. He stood, walked to the door, and looked out into the dark. Snowflakes drifted across the yard, faint silver under the moon. The pines swayed, whispering. Jonas breathed deep, the air sharp in his lungs. Somewhere beyond those trees, beneath the frozen soil, waited the rest of the truth. "Tomorrow," he said quietly to the night. "We'll go find where the light touched her face." Dusty lifted his head, snorted once, as if in answer. Jonas smiled without meaning to. "Good," he whispered. "We'll need each other for this." He shut the door against the cold, laid the journal on the table beside the letters, and blew out the lamp. The dark folded around him, thick and endless. But for the first time, it didn't feel empty. He lay down near the stove, listening to the soft rhythm of the horse outside. The sound steadied his heartbeat, pulling him toward sleep, and just before it claimed him, he thought he heard something else. A faint hum, a voice not quite there, singing the same tune he'd heard the night before. The words were lost to the wind, but the meaning reached him all the same. Forgive the living. The morning broke clean and sharp, the kind that carried a blue light across the snow like glass. Jonas woke before dawn, the fire in the stove long gone cold. His breath fogged the air, and for a moment he just listened. To the soft creak of the walls, to the muffled world outside. He'd dreamed again, though he couldn't remember the details, only the sound of hooves and a woman's voice humming through the wind. He rose, fed the fire, and poured a handful of coffee grounds into the pot. Dusty nickered outside, impatient. Jonas pulled on his coat and stepped into the cold. The horse was standing by the corral, eyes bright, steam rising from his nostrils. Jonas rubbed the side of his neck. "You ready?" he asked. Dusty flicked his tail, the answer plain enough. They climbed the ridge behind the cabin as the sun began to lift. Jonas followed the path Elias's words had drawn, where the light first touched her face. It led toward the far end of the valley, where the pines opened into a slope of frozen meadow. The snow there was unbroken, smooth as linen. Each breath Jonas took cut his throat with cold, but he kept moving. Something inside him, curiosity or guilt, wouldn't let him stop. Halfway up, he paused to look back. The cabin sat small and gray in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney. Beyond it, the valley stretched quiet and endless. He felt both free and trapped, like a man halfway between two worlds. At the top of the rise, the trees thinned, and the sunlight poured through, turning the frost into diamonds. Jonas reined Dusty to a stop. The view opened before them, miles of untouched snow, and in the middle, a shape that broke the perfection. A mound, too even to be natural. He dismounted, boots crunching through the crust. As he neared, he saw a line of stones arranged in a circle, half buried. Kneeling, he brushed the snow away. Underneath, a piece of wood appeared, the grain blackened by time. On it, carved with a knife, were 3 letters, N-A-Y. The last had been split off by the weather. Jonas's throat closed. He sat back on his heels, staring. This was it, the place Elias had written about, where the light first touched her face. He felt the sun on his own, harsh and warm against the cold air. He closed his eyes for a moment. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and something older, sweeter. He turned his head. Dusty stood still, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. The horse let out a low whinny, not of fear, but recognition. Jonas felt the hair on his arms rise. He cleared more snow, finding another board beneath the first. When he pried it loose, something metallic glinted inside. A small tin box, rusted, sealed with wire. He took out his knife and cut it open. Inside lay a folded scrap of cloth, an army kerchief, and beneath it, a single bullet casing dark with osumage. The bottom was stamped with a mark he recognized. U.S. Cavalry. Jonas sat there for a long time, holding the casing between his fingers. It was warm from his hand, or maybe from memory. He imagined Elias standing here, the same snow falling, burying what he couldn't live with. The man had carried this secret until it rotted him from the inside. Dusty shifted behind him, pawing at the ground. "I know," Jonas said quietly. He did it for love. But it killed them both. The words hung in the air, visible like breath. He rewrapped the box, set it back into the hollow, and covered it gently with snow. The wind rose again, scattering powder into his face. He pulled his scarf up, stood, and looked around the clearing. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a confession. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye near the tree line. A faint indentation in the snow, shaped almost like a hoofprint, then another, a few feet away. Jonas followed them slowly, each print leading deeper into the trees. They ended at a fallen log half buried in frost. Beside it, he found another artifact, a strip of leather, stiff but intact. When he lifted it, the metal buckle shone faintly. Military issue, the kind used on saddles. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the initials carved into the leather. E.C. Elias Clay. Jonas exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "You kept it," he said softly. "You came back." Dusty snorted again, stamping his hooves. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing between the trees. For a moment, Jonas thought he heard another horse answering in the distance, a faint, ghostly call, swallowed by wind. He waited, breath held, but the sound didn't return. He looped the strap over his shoulder and mounted up. The cold had sharpened. Clouds were thickening in the west. As they made their way down the slope, the sky darkened, and snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes that blurred the edges of the world. Back at the cabin, Jonas hung his coat by the stove and thawed his fingers. He placed the recovered strap and casing on the table beside the letters and photograph. The collection was growing, each piece a fragment of truth. The more he found, the less he understood why his uncle had chosen to hide it. He lit the lamp, its glow filling the corners with a fragile warmth. The journal lay open where he'd left it. He turned the next page. October 10th. I buried her where the light first touched her face. The earth was frozen, but she was light as wind. Spirit stood beside me until dawn. When I left, I swore never to touch a weapon again. But the past has its own hands. It follows. Jonas read the entry twice, then closed the book. The wind moaned outside, rattling the shutters. He poured a little whiskey from the flask he kept in his pack, the burn steadying his thoughts. He looked toward the window, to where the faint outline of the ridge loomed in the moonlight. He could almost see the clearing up there, the mound, the stones, the mark of her name. "I found her," he whispered, as if speaking to Elias himself. "You can rest now." Dusty stirred outside, a soft sound like a sigh. Jonas leaned back in the chair, feeling the day catch up with him. The heat from the stove crept into his bones, but rest didn't come easy. He dreamed again that night, the kind of dream that felt more like remembering. He saw Elias, younger, standing in the snow, blood on his hands, the horse beside him trembling. The sky was red with dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a woman sang, her voice woven through the wind. When she stopped, the silence cracked like glass. Jonas jerked awake, heart pounding. The fire had burned low. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then he heard it. A faint thump beneath the floor. Soft but deliberate, as if something shifted under the boards. He froze, listening. Dusty's hooves struck the ground outside once, twice. A warning. Jonas reached for the lamp, turned up the wick, and waited. The sound came again, closer to where he slept. A slow creak, then stillness. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Old wood," he muttered, but when he looked down, he saw it. The same loose board from the first night, now slightly raised, as if something below had moved. Jonas knelt, pressing a hand against it. The wood was cold, but not lifeless. He hesitated, then pried it up with his knife. Beneath lay only dirt and darkness. Still, the air that rose from the gap was strange, warm, faintly sweet, like the scent of flowers long gone. He replaced the board and sat back, uneasy. The wind outside howled harder, shaking the door. Dusty neighed once, sharp and frightened. Jonas stood, moved to the window. Snow swirled across the yard, and for an instant he thought he saw a figure by the trees. Pale, still, watching. Then it was gone. He stayed awake until dawn, staring at the stove's dying glow, wondering what exactly he had awakened in that valley, and whether it was done with silence yet. Night fell in slow layers, the color of dying embers spreading across the valley. Jonas fed the stove, the crack of sap inside the logs loud against the silence. Dusty stood close to the window outside, his shadow shifting against the flicker of firelight. Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had followed him back from the ridge. Something that had waited a long time to be noticed. He sat at the table, staring at the journal, the letters, and the little box he'd found under the snow. The bullet casing lay on the wood like an accusation. He turned it between his fingers until the metal warmed from his touch. Elias had written about war, love, loss, but nowhere had he mentioned pulling the trigger himself. Still, Jonas knew a man didn't have to fire a gun to feel its weight forever. The stove's glow deepened, filling the cabin with amber light. He took another sip of whiskey, then leaned back in the chair. The flames swayed, bending and twisting in a rhythm that felt almost alive. He blinked once, twice, and for an instant thought he saw movement beyond the fire, a shape forming in the shimmer of heat. At first it was only color, then outline. The curve of a woman's shoulder, a dark braid, a face half turned toward him. The fire crackled, and the image sharpened. She stood beside the stove, her expression calm, her eyes steady, as if studying him in return. Jonas froze, breath held. Her lips parted slightly, and though the sound was little more than the hiss of flame, he heard her voice inside his chest. "You found me." Jonas blinked hard. The vision wavered and dissolved. The stove snapped, spitting sparks. He looked around the room, empty, unchanged. The only sound was the wind. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bottle. "Old whiskey and older ghosts," he muttered, pouring another inch. Dusty whinnied outside, sharp and uneasy. Jonas stood, went to the door. The night had turned clear, the snow reflecting starlight so bright it hurt his eyes. The horse was restless, head tossing, breath puffing like steam. Jonas rubbed his muzzle. "Easy, boy. Nothing out here but cold." Yet even as he said it, he felt eyes on him, the kind of weight that comes from memory, not flesh. He went back inside, shut the door tight. The air seemed different now, warmer, scented faintly of sage or smoke that wasn't from the stove. The journal lay open to a new page he didn't remember turning. November 2nd. She comes to me in dreams. Her hair smells of smoke and rain. I hear the wind in her voice, and it tells me I will not die alone. Jonas read the words twice. He rubbed his temple, then looked up at the walls, the shadows moving across them like restless water. The fire popped again, and something soft landed near the hearth. An ember, glowing red. When he stooped to pick it up with the poker, he saw that it wasn't coal at all, but a small feather, singed at the edges. He stared at it, confused, then set it carefully on the table. "All right," he said quietly, almost to the air. "If you're here, then say what you want." The only answer was the sound of wind curling through the chimney. He sat back down, exhausted. The flames threw long orange fingers up the wall, painting his face in gold. For a moment his thoughts drifted to Dusty. How calm the horse had been when the world was falling apart. How he seemed to sense things Jonas couldn't. Maybe that was why Elias had written so much about Spirit, the white horse. Maybe animals saw the truth long after people had gone blind to it. He picked up the photograph again. The woman, Naya, stood beside the horse, sunlight spilling across her face. There was a tenderness there, something that reached across the years and pressed lightly against his chest. "You forgave him, didn't you?" he whispered. "You forgave Elias for surviving." A sudden gust rattled the window, the flames leapt, and the feather rose from the table as if caught by unseen breath. It spun slowly in the air, hovered, and drifted toward the photograph. The moment it touched the picture, the light dimmed. Jonas stumbled back, heart hammering. Then everything went still. He stood for what felt like a long time, waiting. When nothing more happened, he forced himself to breathe. "Maybe I'm losing it too," he muttered. "Runs in the family." But when he looked down, he saw that the photograph had changed. The edge of the image where the feather had landed was scorched faintly, the paper curling. He lifted it closer to the firelight. There, in the burn mark, new details appeared, something that hadn't been visible before. Behind Elias and Naya, faintly drawn, was the outline of another man, blurred, watching from the background. A soldier's silhouette. Jonas's stomach tightened. "So that's it," he said under his breath. "Someone followed you." He turned the photograph over, hoping for a clue. The back was blank, except for a faint smear of writing he hadn't noticed before, half rubbed away. Only 2 words were clear. "He knows." Jonas set the picture down, his hands shaking slightly. The old guilt in Elias's letters made more sense now. Someone had betrayed them, or maybe silenced them. He looked at the journal again, then at the bullet casing on the table. The fire hissed, the room breathing with him. "Elias," he said softly, "what did you do to keep her safe?" Dusty neighed again, louder this time, a sharp note of alarm. Jonas hurried to the window. The horse was backing, up, staring toward the woods. There was movement there, a flicker of light, faint but deliberate, like a lantern swinging in the dark. Jonas grabbed his coat, stepped outside. The cold hit him like glass. The lantern light moved between the trees, too steady to be an illusion. He followed it to the edge of the clearing, snow squeaking beneath his boots. "Who's there?" he called. The light stopped, hovering. Then, slowly, it turned and began to move deeper into the forest. He followed, heart pounding. The glow slipped between the trunks, always just out of reach. He stumbled over roots, breath steaming. Finally, it stopped in a small hollow surrounded by birch trees. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin. The lantern rested on the ground now, its flame swaying gently. Jonas crouched, touched the handle. Warm. Real. He lifted it and looked around. "Anyone here?" he said, voice low. Nothing answered, but wind. Then he saw footprints, bare, small, leading away toward the frozen creek. He followed them only a few paces before they vanished into the ice. Beneath the thin layer of frost, he saw something glinting. A pendant caught under the surface. The same jade color as the locket he'd found earlier, but larger, shaped like a running horse. He pressed his palm to the ice. For a moment he thought he felt warmth beneath it, as if the thing still held life. The forest creaked softly around him, branches whispering. He stood there until the cold sank through his gloves. Then he turned back toward the cabin. The lantern's flame burned bright in his hand, unbothered by the wind. When he reached the door, he hung it on the post beside Dusty. The horse had calmed, head lowered. Jonas stroked his neck. "It's all right," he said softly. "We'll figure it out." Inside, he set the lantern on the table next to the photograph and journal. Its light mingled with the fire's glow, casting two shadows instead of one. He sat back down and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know to whom. The dead woman, his uncle, or whatever force watched over this place. All he knew was that the loneliness felt thinner now, the silence less cruel. As the night wore on, he dozed in the chair. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was the lantern flame bending toward the photograph, like a bow of acknowledgement. And somewhere outside, a horse neighed once in the distance, neither Dusty nor any living creature Jonas had ever known. The sound echoed through the pines, soft and endless, until it faded into the wind. The morning came hollow and gray, light, breaking slow through a veil of low clouds. Jonas woke in his chair, neck stiff, the taste of wood smoke thick in his mouth. The lantern on the table had burned out, leaving behind a faint ring of soot. For a moment he thought he'd dreamed it. The woman in the flame, the footprints, the pendant under the ice. Then he saw the feather, blackened and fragile, lying beside the photograph. He reached for it carefully. It crumbled at his touch, falling apart like ash. Dusty shifted outside, the sound of hooves steady, grounding him back to what was real. Jonas pushed himself up and stretched, his joints cracking. "We're still here," he murmured to the horse through the wall. "Still breathing." He added wood to the stove, poured melted snow into the coffee pot, and sat waiting for the water to boil. The cabin smelled of metal and damp pine. He could hear the faint groan of the frozen creek beyond the trees, a slow breathing of the earth itself. Jonas took out Elias's journal again. The pages felt heavier today, the ink darker. He flipped to the last entry he hadn't yet read. November 10th. The ground does not forgive. I buried what was left beneath the northern ridge. But every spring the frost pushes bones to the surface. I collect them, one by one, and place them deeper. Still, the earth remembers. Jonas read it twice, the words sitting heavy in his chest. Beneath the northern ridge. He'd only gone east so far. Maybe there was more hidden beyond the pines. The idea pulled at him like a current. He drained his coffee, pulled on his coat, and went out into the cold. Dusty lifted his head, ears forward. Jonas checked the cinch and swung into the saddle. "Let's see what your old master left us," he said. The horse started at an easy pace, their breath rising in twin clouds that hung in the still air. The path north wound through a stand of spruce trees, their branches heavy with snow. Jonas could hear the distant creak of ice shifting under the thaw. It was warmer than the day before, the kind of warmth that hides a storm. He followed a faint trail, half buried but visible enough for a man who'd spent half his life reading sign. After an hour, they reached the ridge Elias had described. It rose in a long curve, the slope broken by outcrops of rock and patches of bare earth where the snow had melted thin. Jonas dismounted and tied Dusty to a fallen tree. The ground here was soft underfoot, the kind of soil that gave easily. He knelt, brushed away the snow, and saw what the thaw had begun to reveal. Bone. Small white fragments scattered across the dirt. Brittle and clean. He picked one up, too small for a human, too large for a rabbit. Horsebone. His pulse quickened. He followed the fragments, each step leading deeper into a hollow sheltered by the ridge. There, he found what he hadn't expected. 2 sets of bones, intermingled. The long limbs of a horse, the delicate remains of a human arm curled against them. It wasn't a burial so much as a collapse of time, the earth slowly surrendering what it had tried to keep. Jonas crouched, removed his hat, and sat in silence. "So you weren't alone, after all," he whispered. The wind sighed through the trees, carrying the sound away. He looked around for markers, anything Elias might have left, but found nothing except a handful of river stones stacked in a rough circle nearby. The stones were dark with age, their surfaces carved faintly with lines, some kind of symbol, worn nearly smooth. He traced them with his glove. The shapes formed a spiral that reminded him of something he'd seen once on a Lakota medicine wheel. Life, death, and return. Jonas sat back on his heels. "You buried her here," he said quietly, "and spirit beside her." The name came easily now, as if it belonged to both horse and woman. He stayed there longer than he meant to, watching the light shift through the trees. At last he began to cover the bones again, not with snow, but with soil, packing it gently. When he finished, he stood and looked at his work. The ground was smoother now, though he knew the earth would never forget. On the way back to the cabin, Dusty walked slow, his head low. Jonas reached forward, rubbing the horse's neck. "I know," he said softly. "You feel it too." The horse gave a small sound in reply, something halfway between a sigh and a breath. As they neared the cabin, the wind rose, carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke. Jonas dismounted, led Dusty into the lean-to, and brushed the snow from his coat. When he turned, something glimmered faintly near the doorframe. Another carved symbol, almost identical to the one he'd seen on the stones. He brushed away the frost and found it burned into the wood. It hadn't been there before. He ran his thumb over it. The grooves were fresh, the scent of char still faint. "Someone's been here," he said under his breath. But there were no tracks, only snow swirling in circles across the yard. Inside, he threw off his gloves and lit the lamp. The cabin was as he'd left it, except for one thing. On the table, beside the journal, lay the jade pendant he'd seen trapped beneath the ice. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, water still beading on its surface. Jonas stepped closer, his breath catching. He reached out, but stopped short of touching it. The pendant was warm, impossibly so, as though it had just been held in someone's hand. He sat down slowly. The feather, the lantern, the burned mark. Whatever was happening, it was no longer imagination. It was the land itself speaking through what was left behind. He opened the journal again, searching for something he'd missed. Near the back cover, he found a folded scrap of paper tucked between pages. On it was a drawing of the same spiral symbol, surrounded by lines of text written in a trembling hand. To bind the living and the lost, one must return what was taken. The horse knows the way. Jonas set the paper down, staring at it. Dusty's calm eyes came to mind, the way he'd stopped and pawed at certain places, as if guided by memory older than his own. "You know where it ends, don't you?" he murmured. He went back outside. The storm was building. Clouds gathered like bruises over the ridge. Dusty turned his head as Jonas approached, ears pricked. The horse's gaze fixed on something behind him. Jonas followed it and froze. At the edge of the woods, between two trees, stood a figure. Tall, slender, draped in shadow. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a trick of light, but then the figure moved. The outline was unmistakably human, but the face, if it had one, was hidden. Jonas's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped forward, but the figure didn't move closer. It lifted an arm slowly and pointed toward the ridge, the place he'd just come from. Then it was gone, fading into the blur of snow like smoke in wind. He stood there long after, waiting for it to return. It didn't. When he finally went inside, he locked the door and sat by the stove, hands trembling. "Elias," he whispered, "what have you left me?" The pendant on the table glowed faintly, its green light pulsing with each flicker of the fire. Jonas stared at it until the glow faded and only the steady crackle of burning wood remained. Outside, the first flakes of the storm began to fall, covering his footprints, the yard, and the mark on the door, erasing everything, as the earth always does, until only memory is left to speak. He sat there, eyes on the flame, the warmth unable to chase away the chill that had settled somewhere deeper, somewhere no fire could reach. By the time the storm broke, the valley had vanished beneath a curtain of white. Snow hammered the roof, the wind howled through the pines, and the cabin shuddered as though remembering something older than weather. Jonas sat by the stove, boots off, socks steaming beside the fire. He hadn't slept all night. The pendant still lay on the table, pulsing faintly under the lamplight like a heartbeat that refused to die. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the trees, the pointing hand, the ridge, the bones. All of it circling back to Elias. Maybe his uncle hadn't been cursed or mad. Maybe he'd just been haunted by the truth. And now that truth had found its way to him. Jonas reached for the flask in his coat, but his hand stopped halfway. He wasn't sure he wanted the comfort of whiskey tonight. The silence felt too brittle to break. Dusty shifted outside, hooves crunching faintly in the drift. The sound was steady, calm, like a friend pacing to remind him he wasn't alone. The wind dropped for a moment, and in the quiet he heard another sound. Soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. Knocking, 3 times against the door. He froze. The knock came again, harder this time. Jonas's pulse thudded in his ears. He stood, hand on the pistol hanging from a nail by the wall. He hadn't fired it in years, but the weight of it was familiar, comforting. He moved toward the door, each step loud on the wooden floor. When he pulled it open, the wind punched through, bringing snow and the sting of ice, but there was no one there. Only the black wall of the storm, trees bowing under its breath. He squinted, heart racing. The snow swirled, and for an instant he thought he saw movement, a pale shape slipping between the trunks. Then it was gone. He shut the door, barred it, and leaned against the wall, breath ragged. "Enough," he whispered. "Enough of ghosts." When he turned, the pendant was gone. Jonas blinked, crossed the room, and scanned the table. Empty. He dropped to his knees, searching the floorboards, but there was nothing. Then a flicker of light caught his eye, green and soft, coming from under the hearth. He crouched, pried loose the edge of a brick, and found a narrow gap beneath. The glow came from deeper inside. He reached in, fingers brushing something smooth. When he pulled it free, it wasn't the pendant. It was a photograph. Not the one he'd seen before, but another. Older, faded nearly to sepia dust. It showed Elias, his arm around a young soldier in uniform, both men smiling stiffly at the camera. The back read, in Elias's unmistakable handwriting, March 1870, Drummond. Jonas felt the name hit him like a blow. Sheriff Drummond, the son still ran the law office in Bitter Ridge, the same family that had mocked Elias, called him traitor, the same men who'd laughed when Jonas left town. He sat down slowly, piecing it together. Elias and Drummond had served together. Something had happened. Orders, a massacre, maybe worse. Elias had disobeyed. Drummond hadn't. And when it was over, Elias was the one left to bear the guilt. Jonas turned the photo over again. The edges were smudged with something dark. Ink, maybe. Or dried blood. He opened the journal to the final page. His uncle's handwriting had grown erratic, letters slanting, ink blotched as if written in haste. They said she was gone, but I saw her fall. Drummond gave the order. I fired into the air. Spirit shielded her. When the smoke cleared, she was gone. He said it was mercy. But I know mercy wears many faces, and some of them kill. Jonas closed his eyes. "You didn't pull the trigger," he murmured, "but you still bled for it." He sat there for a long time, listening to the storm gnaw at the walls. Dusty whinnied again, restless. Jonas rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The wind had eased, snow falling softer now. The world glowed silver in the moonlight breaking through the clouds. Dusty stood facing the tree line, muscles tense. Jonas followed his gaze. At the edge of the clearing, a dark shape knelt in the snow. It didn't move. He squinted, heart hammering. Slowly, he walked toward it. As he neared, the shape took form. A man in an old cavalry coat, head bowed, hands clasped around something resting in the snow. A revolver. Jonas's revolver. He stopped 10 feet away. The man looked up. It was Elias, or something wearing his face. The eyes were hollow, filled with light like reflection on water. His mouth moved, but no sound came. Jonas wanted to run, to shout, but his body stayed rooted. The figure raised the gun and pointed. not at Jonas, but at the trees behind him. Jonas turned, and through the drifting snow, saw another figure. Broad shoulders, wide hat, the unmistakable stance of a man used to command. Sheriff Drummond. Younger, ghostly, his features carved in ice. The two figures stared at each other across time's divide, and Jonas stood between them. The wind carried a sound then, hooves pounding through the dark. A white blur streaked past, a horse galloping fast, mane whipping like fire. Dusty reared, neighing, as the apparition thundered between the two men. The gun flashed once, the light swallowed everything. Jonas woke face down in the snow, ears ringing. The world had gone silent again. The storm had stopped. The clearing was empty. No figures, no tracks, no blood. Only Dusty, standing nearby, trembling but alive. Jonas pushed himself up, gasping. His pistol lay in the snow beside him, barrel warm. He stared at it, throat tight. "I didn't fire," he whispered. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure. He holstered the gun, led Dusty back toward the cabin. The horse resisted at first, eyes rolling, but followed. Inside, Jonas stripped off his gloves and leaned on the table, every nerve humming. The pendant was back where it had been, gleaming faintly, as if it had never moved. He picked it up, turned it over. Etched into the metal now were 3 new letters. E.C.D. Elias Clay. Drummond. He set it down slowly. "The burden wasn't yours alone," he said aloud. "It's mine now, too." Dusty shifted outside, snorting softly, calmer now. Jonas went to the window. The snow had stopped completely. The moon shone full over the valley, painting everything in silver and blue. The ridge gleamed in the distance, the place where bones slept under the earth. He thought of Elias, of Naya, of spirit, of all the things people bury to keep living. Maybe the land didn't just hold their bones. It held their guilt, their mercy, their love. He whispered to the glass, "Maybe that's what forgiveness really is. Letting the ground take what we can't carry anymore." The wind sighed against the window, almost an answer. He turned back to the table, to the pendant, the journal, the photograph, and the empty flask. Each piece was part of a confession waiting for its final witness. Jonas sat down, pulled the paper and pen from the drawer, and began to write. Not for redemption, but remembrance. His hand shook, but he wrote anyway. "For whoever finds this, know that love and guilt are made of the same dust. My uncle tried to bury his. I'm trying to set it free." He signed his name, folded the paper, and placed it beside the pendant. Then he leaned back, eyes closing. The fire cracked once, bright and brief. Outside, Dusty stamped twice, as if acknowledging the truth of it. The night held its breath. The wind began to rise again the following evening, low and steady at first, then growing into a restless hum that pressed against the walls like breath from some unseen giant. Jonas knew the signs of a real storm. The sky had gone that strange, bruised color that comes before the world folds in on itself. He'd been through blizzards before, but something about this one felt different, heavier, as if it was meant for him alone. He went outside to tie down what he could, the feed sacks, the loose boards near the corral. Dusty stood with his head bowed, snow clinging to his mane, waiting as though he too understood what was coming. Jonas tightened the rope on the gate, gave the horse a slow stroke down the neck. "We'll ride this one out, old boy," he said softly, "just like the others." But when he looked up at the ridge, the clouds were rolling fast and dark, swallowing the last light of day. He could feel the change in the air, the scent of pine, smoke, and something metallic, ozone or memory, he couldn't tell. The snow started, light at first, then in heavy sheets that made the air vanish. By the time he stumbled back into the cabin, his coat was crusted white. The wind hit the door so hard it rattled the hinges. He threw the bolt and leaned against it for a moment, breathing hard. The room glowed with the dull orange of the fire, shadows dancing like ghosts along the walls. The pendant still rested on the table where he'd left it, the green light flickering faintly. He poured water into the kettle, set it on the stove, and crouched close to the warmth. "Guess it's just you and me again," he said to the fire. Outside, the storm answered with a deep, rolling groan. He thought about Elias, how the man must have faced nights like this alone, listening to the wind scream through the valley, wondering if it was the dead or just the cold. He thought about the photo, the bones, the voices he'd heard. All of it felt like a circle closing in, tightening with every gust. Dusty neighed once outside, a short, frightened sound. Jonas stood, grabbed his coat, and opened the door just enough to see. The snow was a wall, thick and blinding. The horse's silhouette flickered in and out of sight like a shadow behind glass. Jonas stepped into the storm, the cold hitting him hard enough to steal his breath. "Easy, boy," he shouted over the wind. Dusty was straining against his tether, eyes rolling white. Jonas reached him, untied the rope, and guided him toward the lee of the cabin where the wind broke a little. The horse pressed close, body trembling. Jonas wrapped his arm around the thick neck, the warmth seeping through the layers of his coat. "We're all right," he said, voice low and steady. "Just noise. Nothing more." But even as he spoke, a sound cut through the wind, a cry, distant but clear. Not the voice of a storm, not human either. It came again, higher this time, mournful. A horse's scream. Jonas froze. It wasn't Dusty. It wasn't any living thing. It came from the ridge. He looked toward the dark blur of trees, his gut twisting. He'd heard that sound once before, years ago, when a mare broke her leg in a canyon, and he'd had to do the merciful thing. It was a sound that never left a man's bones. The cry came again, closer. Dusty jerked his head, ears flat, nostrils flaring. Jonas whispered, "It's her." He didn't know how he knew, but he was sure. Spirit, or whatever was left of her. He half-dragged, half-led Dusty back inside, bolted the door, and dropped to the floor beside the stove. The horse's breathing came loud through the wall, the wind filling every space between. Jonas pressed his hands together without thinking, the motion awkward, half forgotten, something his mother used to make him do when storms hit their ranch long ago. He wasn't a praying man, hadn't been since the war. But the words came anyway, rough and cracked. If there's anyone listening, if there's any mercy left in this place, let it end. The storm roared back, as if answering. The windows shook, snow finding every crack. The flames in the stove leaned sideways, drawn toward the chimney by a sudden suction of air. Jonas stood, heart hammering. A sound like footsteps echoed overhead, crossing the roof. Slow, deliberate. He reached for his pistol on the table. The sound came again, heavier this time. He aimed toward the ceiling, then stopped. Dusty gave a low, rumbling whinny, not fear this time, but warning. Jonas lowered the gun, grabbed the lantern, and climbed the ladder to the loft. The roof beams creaked under him. He swung the light slowly, shadows stretching like thin fingers. Nothing. Just old rafters, hay dust, and the wind. Then, from the corner near the eaves, a glint. He lifted the lantern. Wedged between two boards was a small tin box. His breath caught. He crawled over, pulled it free, and climbed back down. By the fire, he pried it open. Inside were several folded pages, yellowed and delicate. He unfolded one carefully. It was another letter, unsigned. If the storm comes again, it means the earth is restless. She will not sleep until the truth is told. Do not hide from it, Elias. Speak the name of the one you spared, and the wind will quiet. Jonas frowned. The one you spared, he said aloud. Naya? But no. The writing didn't sound like her. The voice in those words was different, pleading, not forgiving. Maybe one of the soldiers, one of the others who had lived. He read the second page. You were right. She lived. The bullet missed. I helped her cross the river, but if they learn she breathes, they'll hang us both. The words blurred. Jonas read them again and again, his heart pounding harder each time. She lived. He stood so fast the chair tipped over. She lived, he whispered. Elias, you fool, you didn't know. Outside, thunder cracked. Deep, rolling, alive. The storm slammed the walls so hard dust fell from the beams. Dusty screamed again, hooves thudding against the frozen ground. Jonas ran to the door, threw it open. The snow whipped sideways, the sky a swirl of gray and silver. In the distance, on the ridge, a shape stood against the wind. A woman's figure, hair streaming, her outline glowing faintly in the lightning. She raised her arm, pointing toward him. Jonas stepped into the storm, the cold slicing through his coat. He could barely see, but he kept walking, each step sinking to his knees. If you're real, he shouted, show me! The wind took his words, flung them back as whispers. He stumbled, fell, clawed his way up again. The light on the ridge flickered once more, then vanished. By the time he made it back to the cabin, he was half frozen, shaking from exhaustion. He closed the door, leaned his back against it, and slid to the floor. The storm was at its height now, hammering the valley with a fury that felt personal. The pendant on the table began to glow brighter, flooding the room with soft green light. The fire dimmed, shadows dissolving. Jonas stared, breath shallow. The light pulsed, faster and faster, until the cabin seemed to breathe with it. And then, silence. The wind stopped. The air stilled. Jonas realized he could hear only his own heartbeat and Dusty's steady breathing outside. He looked at the pendant. It no longer glowed, just a dull piece of jade again. He reached for it, his hands shaking. As his fingers closed around it, a voice, not outside, not in his head, but everywhere, whispered one word. Forgive. Jonas bowed his head, clutching the pendant to his chest. I will, he said, his voice breaking. God help me, I will. The warmth that followed wasn't from the fire. It came from something deeper, something older than his grief. For the first time since arriving, the cabin felt alive, not haunted. The air smelled of pine and rain, though no rain had fallen. Jonah sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet. The storm had ended, but he could feel its echo moving through him, the way the earth exhales after a long-held breath. Outside, the clouds broke apart, revealing the first stars. Dusty nickered softly, head turning toward the ridge. Jonah smiled faintly. "Yeah," he whispered. "I heard her too." He placed the pendant back on the table, next to the letters and journal. Then he knelt beside the stove, head bowed, and for the first time in 30 years, he prayed. Not for safety, not for redemption, but for peace, for Elias, for Naya, for himself, and for the land that had kept their secrets too long. When he rose, the fire had burned low, but the room was bright enough with its own kind of light. When morning came, it did so gently, like a whisper through the valley after too long a silence. The storm had passed, the air was crisp and clear, and for the first time in weeks, Jonas could see the full stretch of the ridge. The world lay washed and reborn. Every branch glistened with ice, every pine needle caught the sun. It was a morning so bright it almost hurt to look at, the kind of light that made even the scars of the land seem clean. Jonas stepped outside, blinking against the glare. His boots sank deep into the soft snow, now heavy and thawing under the first warmth of spring. Dusty stood near the corral, coat steaming, his breath steady. Jonas walked over, brushed the horse's neck, and for a moment they simply stood together in silence. "You made it, boy," he said softly. "Guess we both did." There was no wind, no threat in the air, only the sound of water running beneath the ice, the slow, patient rhythm of the earth waking up. Jonas turned toward the ridge where he'd buried the bones. The snow there had begun to sink, revealing patches of dark soil, like the skin of something once hidden, now ready to breathe again. He went back inside the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, the pendant on the table dull, but no longer cold. It looked ordinary now, as if its work was done. The journal lay open beside it. He hadn't written since the storm, but he felt something stir inside him. A calm, unlike anything he'd known before. He picked up the pen. The ink dragged across the page, slow but sure. March 3rd, the storm ended last night. I thought I heard her voice again, but maybe it was only the wind through the pines. Either way, I think she's at peace now. Maybe Elias, too. He set the pen down, rubbed his eyes. Outside, water dripped from the eaves in slow, steady drops. The sound was steady, alive. It reminded him of the years he'd spent running cattle through spring rains, before the drinking and the loneliness. He'd forgotten that the land could sound like hope. By noon, the thaw had deepened. The snow near the creek was collapsing, small rivulets carving new paths through the mud. Jonas went to fetch water and stopped mid-step. Something glinted among the stones. He knelt, brushed the slush aside, and found a rusted horseshoe, half buried in the mud. The edges were bent, one nail still stuck through the curve. He lifted it, wiped it clean. The metal was old, the kind used decades ago, Elias's time. "Well," he murmured, "looks like you left me one more sign." He carried it back to the cabin and nailed it above the door, right side up this time. For luck. The days that followed passed slowly, the way they do when the world decides to rest. Jonas repaired the roof, fixed the hinges, built a new fence around the corral. He worked without hurry, letting the rhythm of the chores fill the silence. In the evenings, he'd sit on the steps with Dusty beside him, watching the last of the snow vanish under the sunset. It was during one of those evenings that he noticed something strange. At the edge of the clearing, near the old pine stump, wildflowers had started to bloom, pale blue, too early for the season. He walked over, crouched to touch them. The ground was warm there, as if the frost refused to linger. He smiled, small and quiet. The thaw revealed more than flowers. A week later, while digging near the corral post, Jonas struck wood. He brushed away dirt, tutus, found the corner of another box, larger than the one before. Inside were tools, letters wrapped in wax paper, and a small leather pouch of coins so tarnished they looked green. On top of it all was a folded note in Elias's handwriting. "If you found this, it means you stayed. Thank you. This land needs a keeper more than an owner. Bury the dead well, and they'll guard the living." Jonas read the note twice, then folded it carefully. The words didn't sting this time. They felt like a benediction. That evening, he built a small cross of pine branches and carried it to the ridge. The snow was mostly gone now, the soil soft beneath his boots. He planted the cross where the stones had been and pressed his palm to the earth. Dusty grazed quietly behind him. "I kept my promise," Jonas said to the ground. "I buried them well." A breeze moved through the trees, gentle, almost playful. For a moment he thought he heard a horse's soft whinny far away, followed by the faint laughter of a woman. He closed his eyes, let it wash over him. When he returned to the cabin, the light was fading. He brewed coffee, the scent rich in the warm air. As he sat by the fire, he realized how long it had been since the cabin had smelled of anything but ash. He took out the journal one last time. March 10th. Snow's gone from the valley. The creek runs free again. I think Elias was right. The land remembers, but it also forgives. I'll stay here till spring turns to summer, maybe longer. There's work to do. Fences to mend, graves to tend. I don't mind. For the first time in my life, I know where I belong. He looked up from the page, eyes catching on the pendant. It no longer glowed, no longer hummed with unseen life. It just lay there, simple and still. He reached out, brushed his thumb across it, then slipped the chain around Dusty's neck. "There," he said. "You carried us both this far. You keep it now." The horse lifted his head, as if in acknowledgement, and gave a slow exhale that stirred Jonas's hair. That night, the sky was so clear he could see the Milky Way stretch across the valley, a river of white fire. He sat outside until the chill drove him back in. The land had changed. No longer a graveyard, but a home. The ghosts had gone quiet, leaving behind only the peace they'd been denied in life. Jonas didn't pray this time. He didn't need to. The prayer had already been answered in the thaw, in the sound of melting snow and running water, in the steady heartbeat of the earth reclaiming itself. Before he slept, he stood at the window, looking out toward the ridge. The moonlight turned the clearing silver, and for an instant he thought he saw a white horse standing there, head lifted toward the stars. Then the wind moved, and it was gone. He smiled, a small, tired smile. "Good night," he said softly. The stove clicked, settling into its glow. The cabin, the land, the man, and the horse, all of it finally breathed in rhythm, and outside, under the pale wash of moonlight, the last of the snow melted quietly into the soil, feeding the roots of new life waiting just beneath the surface. By late spring, the valley had turned to green again. The snow that once sealed every sound was gone, replaced by the soft hum of water and wind. Grass pushed through the damp earth, and the air smelled of pine and sun-warmed bark. Jonas Clay stood on the porch, sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching Dusty graze in the meadow where the drifts had been. The horse's coat gleamed dapple brown and silver in the morning light. For the first time, Jonas noticed how young the world looked when winter finally surrendered. He had stayed longer than he'd meant to. Weeks had slipped by in quiet rhythm, mending the fence, chopping wood, fixing the leak in the roof. The cabin no longer groaned at night. It breathed. Sometimes he caught himself humming while he worked, the same tune that had haunted his dreams all those weeks ago. He didn't fight it anymore. It was just part of the air here now. He'd written a letter to the town clerk, asking that the property title remain unclaimed under his name. Caretaker instead of owner. He doubted anyone would read it twice. Bitter Ridge was 2 days away by horse, and most men there would rather forget the valley existed. That suited him fine. After breakfast, Jonas walked out to the ridge. The grass there had grown tall, dotted with the same blue flowers that had first broken through the thaw. He knelt by the small cross he'd made, brushed away a few fallen needles, and spoke softly. "You can rest easy now," he said. "You're not alone anymore." A warm breeze swept through the trees, and he could have sworn he felt a light touch on his shoulder. Nothing ghostly, just kind. He smiled, stood, and turned back toward the cabin. Dusty was waiting at the gate, ears forward, as if sensing something Jonas didn't. "You want to stretch your legs, don't you?" Jonas said, patting the gelding's neck. The horse nickered low in his throat. Jonas saddled him with slow, practiced movements, the leather creaking like an old hymn. He'd almost forgotten the comfort of weight in the stirrup, the smell of sweat and horsehair, the quiet power in every step. He mounted, feeling the easy sway beneath him. "Let's see what's left of the world," he murmured. Dusty started forward, hooves sinking softly into the grass. They followed the trail along the river, where water now rushed clear and quick over stones. The valley spread wide, the mountains still capped in snow but softened by distance. Birds wheeled overhead, hawks, ravens, things that had waited out the cold. Jonas breathed deep. Every exhale tasted like freedom. When they reached the far bluff, he reined Dusty in and looked out over the land. The cabin sat small and square among the trees, smoke rising thin from its chimney. From here, it looked less like a home and more like a promise, the proof that something broken could still stand. He thought of Elias then, not as a ghost, but as a man who'd made mistakes, who'd loved fiercely and suffered for it, who had tried, in his own way, to put something right. Jonas wondered if Elias had ever stood in this same spot, looking down at the valley, realizing that love and pain were never separate things. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. Dusty flicked his ears, turned his head toward the western hills. Jonas followed his gaze and saw, for a heartbeat, the shimmer of a white horse moving through the sunlight. It wasn't spirit, it couldn't be, but it moved with the same grace, the same steady rhythm. He didn't chase it. He just watched, until it vanished behind a rise. "You see it too, don't you?" he said. Dusty snorted softly, as if answering yes. They stayed on the ridge until the shadows began to lengthen, then turned back. The world was painted gold now, every blade of grass catching the last light of day. As they rode, Jonas felt something settle inside him. Not joy exactly, but peace, deep and solid. When they reached the cabin, he dismounted, unsaddled Dusty, and let him wander free. The horse lingered near the porch, grazing, his tail flicking lazily. Jonas sat on the steps with his coffee tin, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky burned crimson, then purple, then finally fell into that soft western blue that belonged to the end of all good days. Jonas leaned back against the railing, eyes half closed. The wood was warm under his palms. He thought of the people he'd lost, the woman whose name he no longer spoke, the friends buried on battlefields, Elias with his haunted eyes, and Naya, whose song had carried through the fire. They weren't gone, not really. They lived in the land now, in the water and the wind. He could feel them everywhere. As the first stars came out, Dusty lifted his head and let out a low, rolling whinny. Jonas looked toward the ridge. In the pale light, he saw movement. A soft glow near the cross, like fireflies gathering in a slow, swirling dance. Then the glow rose higher, spread wide, and faded into the dark. He didn't move. He just whispered, "I saw you." The night deepened. The valley grew quiet, save for the steady hum of crickets and the low rush of the creek. Jonas stayed there until the coffee went cold, his thoughts drifting like smoke. Later, when the moon climbed high, he stood, stretched his back, and walked over to Dusty. "One more ride," he said. The horse turned his head, eyes reflecting starlight. Jonas mounted bareback this time, no saddle, no rope, just trust. They moved slowly through the meadow, the grass brushing against his boots, the world silvered under the moon. He could hear nothing but the sound of hooves and his own heartbeat, steady and sure. At the far edge of the clearing, he stopped. The cabin stood behind him, small and quiet, its single window glowing faintly. Ahead lay the open land, fields, river, mountain, sky. He let his gaze linger on it, then leaned forward and whispered, "Go on." Dusty started at a trot, then broke into a canter, then a run. The wind roared in Jonas's ears, cold and wild, tearing through the years between what had been and what was left. He didn't pull back. He laughed, raw and sudden, a sound swallowed by the night. They slowed only when the ridge rose again before them. Jonas stopped, breathing hard, his heart pounding in time with Dusty's. The moon hung low and white, lighting the land like a dream. He swung off the horse, stood beside him, and looked one last time toward the valley. "This is it," he said softly. "This is home." He rested his forehead against Dusty's neck. The horse's breath warmed his skin. For a long while they stayed that way, man and animal, two survivors stitched together by fate and forgiveness. When they finally turned back, the dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. The world glowed pale gold again, the same color as the first morning he'd arrived. But this time, the weight in his chest was gone. He rode back to the cabin in silence. At the door, he paused, looking out one last time before stepping inside. "Thank you," he said, to Elias, to Naya, to the valley, to the wind. Then he closed the door gently behind him. Inside, the stove flickered to life with a sigh, as if it too had been waiting. Jonas sat by the fire until the light grew stronger, until the birds began their morning song. Outside, Dusty grazed near the porch, the pendant around his neck catching the sun's first spark. It flashed once, bright and brief, like a promise kept. And above them, the valley breathed, alive, forgiven, and forever changed. If this story touched something quiet in you, tell me what stayed with you the most. Leave a comment. I read every one of them. And if you'd like to hear more stories of people and the horses that changed them, make sure to subscribe and stay with me for the next ride.